panel is called Mobilizing Innovation, the Role of Government. How does governance drive climate innovation in both the race to net zero and the race to resilience? And governance is a broad term. I think a lot of us would define that in various ways. So our panelists will help talk about that. We're very fortunate to have with us today Elizabeth Small, who's the General Counsel and Head of Policy for the Climate Disclosure Project, which is doing incredible work to help incentivize innovation and reveal what's going on with the environmental impacts of economic activity. It was launched over 20 years ago, and a lot of people don't already know about it. So I'm looking forward to hearing more from Elizabeth. But it is the premier global data and disclosure platform. It works with investors, companies, and governments, as well as I think state and local level, on increasing sustainability and innovation by measuring and analyzing the environmental impacts of their activities. So Elizabeth plays a lead role in that organization, particularly in North America. She works on investor disclosure standards, supply chain issues, and climate resilient infrastructure, and of course, water security risks and disclosure, which is a growing emphasis for the Climate Disclosure Project. We're also very fortunate, I'm sorry I didn't find you earlier today, but we have Manuel Carmona Yebra. He's based here in Washington. He's with the European Union's delegation to the United States. I know your ambassador, he's a wonderful guy. He is the counselor there for the environment and oceans. And I looked him up on LinkedIn, so I can tell you that he worked for well over 10 years in Brussels for the European Union itself. He has an incredible background on climate resilience and climate issues generally. He's been part of the UNFCCC negotiations on climate change related adaptation and on that very contentious and important issue of loss and damage, as well as on climate change in oceans, coastal adaptation, and ocean-based renewable energy, a cool subject. He's been involved with all sorts of collaboration activities, including with the Global Covenant of Mayors on climate change issues. And so what we have here today is someone who works in an NGO context, trying to promote understanding of climate risks and climate innovation, and someone who works with a large group of countries, a very unruly large group of countries, on the issue of climate innovation. And I've got questions for both of them that I've prepared. And what I want to do is have them each start by giving us a little bit of background on their perspectives on how this work is going in their context. So Elizabeth, if you could just give us a few minutes, and then we'll return to you in just a second.
Thank you very much. We have a fantastic moderator today. I am thrilled to be here today and have the opportunity to talk about the work that we do at CDP. I do have a few slides just to introduce CDP, if that's possible. There's a magical wand. No. So I want to introduce CDP to all of you. When I first started, everyone kind of wore as a moniker that we were once written about as the most powerful NGO you've never heard of, which is kind of changing over time as disclosure becomes mandated in many jurisdictions throughout the globe. CDP, okay, let's see if I can do this. Oh, there we go. Okay, we're here. Oh, okay. Introduction to CDP. So we are a global environmental nonprofit working to secure a thriving economy. We believe that information is the basis for quality decision making, both in the in our personal lives and in the corporate sector, as well as with governments. And we work to inform policy. We believe that the world's economy looks to CDP as the gold standard of reporting, and we aim to make environmental reporting mainstream. We've seen tremendous change over the last several years. The basic model of how we work, we started in 2000 with 35 investor signatories, really just a handful of signatories requesting information that on companies environmental impacts. I joke that we're a bit like Madonna. We were the Carbon Disclosure Project, and now we're CDP because we've expanded outside of carbon disclosure into forests, water security, moving into oceans and to other areas along the ESG lines. We work with investors. Now we have over 680 institutional investors. As this work has expanded and we had high quality scope 1 and 2 emissions, and looking at our scope 3 emissions, we realized that we had to work across the value chain and created a supply chain membership engagement program. So we now also work with 13,000 companies with some of the largest procurement entities in the world to look at the environmental impacts of those entities. Our three main focus areas are in climate, forests, and water. Today, we're thinking about a lot about the business impacts, procedures, risks, and opportunities, the facility level accounting, governance and strategy, tactics and linkage, and our module, which is dedicated to water security. These are just some numbers to tell you how we've expanded over time. The amplification effect we talk about frequently, that this feedback loop of using data to inform corporate decision making and therefore pushing ambition in governments and policymakers. We have seen tremendous growth. Here is the water security questionnaire over time in disclosures, and the number of companies that respond to CDP water security questionnaire has grown year on year. Now, we all know that water is a global risk driver. We know there's potential financial risks and costs of response. We talk about opportunities, and we have seen this shape mandatory reporting in various jurisdictions. Now, we know that business as usual is not working. I don't have to tell anyone here what all of the risks are. We know that there is a need for US $670 billion of annual investment to meet our water-related standards now. Our global report identified that the cost of inaction, though, is 5 times greater than the cost of doing something. So we use data to demonstrate this for various decision makers. The private sector is vital to delivering a water secure future. We link companies in the food, textile, retail, energy, industrial chemicals, and pharmaceuticals and mining account for over 70% of this use. And it's important that we are able to get this. I've given you a quick preview of what our water questionnaire structure looks like. We are looking to eliminate negative impacts on fresh water and align business with success in a water secure future. We also work in alignment with the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosure. And this is just an example of what we've done, aligning the pillars and metrics of things like the nature-based standards and the TCFD standards to actionable questions so that companies have actionable decisions based on the data and reporting. So this is just on the pillar of governance. You can see how we've taken the questions and included this so that it becomes really a strategic illumination tool for companies. And that is CDP, and I look forward to a lovely discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Manuel is kind enough to share with us some of his perspectives on adaptation and the European Union's approach to it, and what sorts of governance issues they are dealing with and advancing as they do so.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And I'm very happy that I was invited for this event. I wanted to start with a little test for you. Who among you have heard about the European Green Deal? Oh, you want me to go there? Okay, Anne has heard about it. Anybody else has heard about the European Green Deal? You can raise your hands. With pride, you can raise your hands with pride, actually. European Green Deal, yeah. Okay, just to have an idea where we are. Well, congratulations for all those. It's something that happens in the other side of the Atlantic. So Right. I've been working in a number of fields where water is important. It's a cross-cutting issues. We all know that, particularly you experts on this field. Now it's not only a cross-cutting issue, it's also an issue of having either too much of it or too little. It's handling a new baseline here where things are not as they used to be in the past. Climate change means we have, as I said, too much water coming in, floods, disaster, or too little, we have drought, or a combination of both in different seasons in different parts of the world. Now, I want to talk just briefly about the domestic progress in the EU on better water management, and also the international developments, which are important. The EU, as you know, is a 27-member organization. Yeah, sometimes someone mentioned, yeah, with some disputes, but generally, you know, a good neighborhood and doing things together. So I will deal also with the international aspects. Domestic aspects first. We have 450 million people that need to be provided with this essential element, water. All sectors, as I said, cross-cutting issues are involved on this. The main architecture in Europe for water management is actually composed of two main elements: the Water Framework Directive, called, and the Floods Directive. Directives are a very interesting case of how to use a legislative mechanism to ensure a hands-off approach at the same time as you impose some criteria on the member states, who are all sovereign member states. You know, they're sovereign countries. Directive is an interesting instrument, I was saying, because it sets common objectives. At the same time, it doesn't say how each member state has to go and comply with that objective. It has to enact its own legislation in its own language, within its own legal system, but with common objectives. It's a very intelligent element. And I say these two main pillars of the water policy in the EU are the Water Framework Directive, kind of the mother of the water directives, there are more, and the Flood Directive. One of the innovations in policy making in the last few years has been to achieve a common implementation system for these two regulations, these two directives. At the beginning, they used to be implemented in consultation with member states and stakeholders differently, separately. Now we've come to a common system, and this is crucial because, as I said, everything is connected in the idea of the European Green Deal on which all this water policy is developed. This is the kind of bigger umbrella. There are other specific regulations emanating from the Water Framework Directive, for example, on drinking water, bathing water, reuse of water in the agricultural sector, etc., etc. I'm not going to go obviously through all of those. But I wanted to tell you, still in the domestic arena of the EU, that in 2019, 2-3 years ago, we did a check, what we call a fitness check of this legislation, of this architecture, to see if, if it's still fit for purpose. And we found, indeed, it is fit for purpose still, but climate change is a new element where we need to improve the implementation, not least enforcement. And for this, we are proposing new environmental crime directives with emphasis on water crime, for example, illegal abstraction. And this is in the books now. A proposal was issued last year. And among other issues, the member states will have to review all the permits that they have issued on water abstraction, water impoundments across the EU by 2027. There are other elements there, but I'm not going to go through them. This is, in essence, so the Water Framework Directive, Floods Directive, and all the kind of daughter directives are the architecture of how water management and water use is regulated in the EU. Now going into the international part of my talk, here you probably know this because, as I said, you are experts on this field, that 27% of the global population in the world now lives in areas where water scarcity can be labeled as severe. This is a basic human right, basic environmental right, and yet 27% of the population lives in these areas. This is a recipe for disaster. Now, what are we doing in the EU to try to engage internationally? First, I would highlight the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, the UNESE, which is one of the regional UN organizations, in which we are very active in the UN ECE Convention, the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe Convention, which is a model, I would say, for other regions of the world in engaging the wider European area, not only the EU, but also extending to the continental countries and even beyond. This could be a model, for example, for regional integration, regional cooperation in the water issues. We also support, as you know, of the communique issued recently by the G7. And there, indeed, there was a section 8, I remember, on sustainable and climate resilient water management that was very important for the UN, where we had most of our principles reflected and our ideas. Another important forum is going to be, as you know very well, by the end of the year, UNFCCC COP27. COP27 is going to be in Egypt, you know that, Sharm el Sheikh. And this is going to be very much about adaptation. The Nile is shared between several countries. It's source of floods. It's source of, water scarcity as well, when countries upstream abstract too much water and leave little for Egypt at the end of the river basin. So all these water issues, I can predict will be huge. I'm no longer working as a negotiator in the UNFCCC, but adaptation is growing year by year as one of the elements for discussion and controversy as well. I wanted to finalize this international overview of the EU activities with our role on the UN Water Conference next year in 2023. I'm sure you're aware this conference will be crucial. The EU is already preparing for it. The Commissioner for Environment and Oceans, a big boss in Brussels, kind of minister level, if you don't know what a commissioner is. He was in Tajikistan, if I remember well, in Dushanbe recently. And there he put forward the 6 priorities that the EU will highlight and will promote in this conference. And these priorities are water governance, improving vertical integration of administrations to ensure that water is indeed in policy making treated as a cross-cutting issue. Second priority will be the links with climate change, biodiversity, food security, an important issue in our time. The third priority will be transboundary water cooperation. I mentioned already for the Nile and certain river basins is crucial. Fourth would be financing and capacity building, trying to help developing countries in particular to have the critical mass to handle water management better, water management better, including integrated systems. Fifth priority, human rights, water access, wash, sanitation, and hygiene also as a human right. And six, why not exploring from the point of view of the EU, voluntary commitments as part of that conference? Why not having this voluntary commitment issued at that conference? We have several tools to enable all this international work. I'm not going to go through them. The main one I would say is the Global Europe Instrument, which gathers 80 billion euros over the next 6-7 years to help, as I said, developing countries with their water, sanitation, and hygiene systems. So all in all, in the EU, I would say the 3 I's are the important lighthouses for guiding the policy on water management. The 3 I's for us are implementation, needs to be reinforced. I was mentioning it, environmental crime, etc. Investment, crucial, put the means in place. Recovery from COVID has to be linked to investments in water management. And third, intelligence. Having the data, we have a European drought observatory, put together all the models that we have, making sure the sources of flood are modeled coherently. And we don't have models that cover the floods from the sea, completely disconnected from floods from the river basins, right? So all these 3 I's are important: implementation, investment, and intelligence. Thank you. Happy to discuss afterwards.
So, Manuel, you don't get off the hook just yet. Um, that was a really useful overview of some of the governance structures and programmatic approaches that the EU takes to adaptation, and particularly to water, both within the EU and with developing countries. Do you have a view, or can you share with us thoughts on which of these things, in your experience, is most able to drive the kinds of changes in the three I's areas, whether it's implementation, investment, or intelligence? What do you think is working best to create innovation in those three buckets?
Thank you. Innovation is crucial. I would divide it in two realms: the innovation in technologies and the innovation in social issues, and the what I call a water culture, water reuse, water efficiency culture. In the first, the technology in the EU, we have a Horizon Europe program. You probably have heard about it. It's a research program which is valid for 7 years and encompasses a budget of around 95.5 billion euros. So it's a massive investment, higher relatively than in other budgetary periods that I know of. And in this massive budget, we have invested in 6 huge areas. One of them is climate, for example, and climate adaptation and resilience in the field of water will be one of those. There's also for natural resources and biodiversity, restoration of water ecosystems. How can we use innovation, for example, or innovative business models to value better the ecosystem services that are provided by coastal wetlands, by inland wetlands that are lost at a dramatic speed, both here in the US, but also in Europe, where we have actually lost most of them already. Can we restore those? So that's a huge budget and a huge effort in research. I want to mention in particular within that field of research also the platform Water for All. This is a partnership of the stakeholders and governments that will be financed by this Horizon Europe. But there are also missions, research missions, kind of moonshots, like here in the US when you had President Kennedy saying we will be in the moon in 10 years. Well, we don't think we will match that, to be honest with you. But we have established some missions, with some results-oriented thinking. And one of those is on adaptation to climate change. Another one is for healthy seas and inland waters. So this will be, is a very wide, overview of what this research program of 95 billion euros will do. So that's one part. The second part of innovation that we absolutely need, and where it is difficult to be optimistic, is about a water culture where we learned to be more efficient and change attitudes in people, but also in companies and in certain sectors, change mentalities. This is where the inertia takes us always to the same place. We're recovering from COVID. The inertia is, we all say that, coming back to normal. But was the normal something that we really wanted to be in the first place? What were we calling normal? We also with a moving target behind us, which is climate change. So it's there. I don't have easy solutions, but I can point at another priority of the EU: digital solutions. And we have heard it in the former presentation. We have heard how artificial intelligence, for example, is allowing for better management of circular processes, circular economy. We can also have artificial intelligence, and this is happening already in intelligent smart grids for electricity, smart water systems that go beyond preventing leaks and illegal abstraction to actually better allocating rights between users and better tariffs, etc., so that make your system cost efficient and at the same time more sustainable in the long term. Right? Sorry, went on for a long time. Thanks.
I'm glad you're able to go on for a long time on that issue because it's important. Elizabeth, Manuel just mentioned water culture, and I know that your organization has issued a report called High and Dry, as you mentioned. And I was wondering if you can share with us examples so that we can understand it more viscerally of how CDP's disclosure questions and data, its impact analysis, and its public reporting can and has helped to drive the governance changes and innovations that advance water security and change the water culture.
Love that question. Thank you very much. So, we really have seen a growing recognition that the financial world is not separate from the natural world. Um, the, you know, you mentioned the recent report that we did about stranded assets, and the reality is that there are already enormous, enormous stranded assets. In the U.S., we say the latest report found 15.5 billion has already been stranded or is at risk due to water issues. This is just the tip of the iceberg, of course. There are likely to be more water stranding events exacerbated by increasing growth across water-intensive companies. Companies in key industries are already losing billions. We know that. CDP data shows that the companies that are reporting are exposed to substantial risk that can lead to 225 billion in financial losses. The top 25, though, known financial institutions are providing 2.5 trillion in financing to the world's most impactful, water impactful companies. And yet, 1/3 of these listed financial institutions are still not assessing the exposure of their activities to water issues. So it's leaving them really in the dark, and all of us, about the issues that we face. In my view, those three I's are certainly interconnected. We absolutely need the information to be able to drive innovation and move capital. This is the model that CDP seeks to find. The good news is that we are seeing increased disclosure. We're seeing increased pressure as companies are asked by the companies to which they supply to, their customers, and also by the investors. We know that companies that do disclose have a 19 percentile increase in access to capital. There was a study out of McGill that showed that. So we have certainly some incentives. When we're thinking about the behavior, I joke. So I don't know if any of you have lived through the dystopian hellscape that is parenting during a pandemic and homeschooling, but my daughter, was listening into some of these calls that I would have, and I'd be giving numbers and trying to go on and on. And she sits down one day the way only kind of like a tween can do, like, what your problem is? Like, what is my problem, darling? The problem is that what you do is so terrifying and so boring. And it's like, that's it. Like, that, I had to admit, like, that's it. Like, that's the challenge that we all have. It's terrifying and yet so boring. So how do we bridge that? And we can do that, with the culture piece. We can do that by showing capital. We can do that by demonstrating that it is what constituents want, what customers want, what investors want, and other than that, we have to be creative in the way that we manage behavior and get technology funded.
You've actually reminded me of something that I talked about a lot with folks at the last COP, which is that we do scare people, and they don't always react very well to that. I thought fear was a great motivator, but it turns out maybe not. So do either of you want to comment on the notion that we can show them that we can help them learn to imagine, that we don't necessarily have to sacrifice, as people have talked about, we don't have to sacrifice everything that we hold dear, our current habits and so on, that these changes in culture can actually make our lives better? And how does disclosure, or how does the EU's approach to communicating with its constituents, whether they're within the EU or overseas, how do we show people that getting to adaptation and making these culture changes is actually potentially positive for them, not just avoiding bad stuff?
That's yeah, that is the crux of the question. That is what I was referring to as water culture, which could be basically translated as adaptation culture or change culture. Things are changing around you. Are you ready to adapt to them and therefore change yourself or not? Change is always difficult in organizations, and systemic changes like we are seeing are everybody is involved. But I always say to my climate colleagues, I mean, I used to work in the climate department, now more in the wider environmental issues. We are having the wrong narrative sometimes towards people. And I'll tell you why. If you talk about emissions, you inevitably need to start explaining how the climate system works, which leads you to explain, the laws of thermodynamics, possibly equations, how the biomes interact with you're going to lose people very quickly. However, we have seen in the last 2 years in particular how when you talk about people's health, this is a different matter. If I'm going to get sick, or behaviors from myself and from companies around me are going to make me sick, or are going to make my kids sick, or my kids are not going to have a future, that's a different matter. That's why when we talk about emissions and CO2, I always encourage colleagues to talk also about air pollution. They go combined. The same solutions apply to both. But talk about emissions, of course, but insist on how many people would be out of hospital, how would you reduce the amount of kids with asthma. This is what people say, oh, we can do that and solve climate change at the same time. This is great. The same for ecosystem restoration. Talk to people, well, it's just to save, I don't know, dolphins, or to save fishes in the coast. And that's, people are for that. But if you tell them that, your food security, or, food security of people around the world will be threatened if we don't keep our fish stocks healthy, if we don't keep our coasts healthy, um, this is a different narrative. You're talking about food, you're talking about health. I think changing the pattern whereby we take climate as something that people will connect with, people will have hardship to connect with it. It's just too abstract. That's my point of view.
That's fantastic. I'm so CDP is very data focused, and I think it's helpful for us to remember that the narrative is also very important. And that narrative is something that I think we have, I've experienced anecdotally after the pandemic that people have experienced supply chain disruptions. People have experienced, what that feels like, and a way that we're connected in a way that they hadn't perhaps had the experiential piece before. Not that I would wish this upon the world, but having that as an access point to be able to interpret data, because you're right. Sometimes when we're looking at the numbers, it can confuse think about this as what is the actual impact. So I think the other answer to your question is just that we have to show how the risks are beneficial to know because they exist, right? We have to demonstrate that the cost of inaction is greater than the cost of action. I think we can also demonstrate that by showing the benefits to a company's ability to scale, government's ability to provide solutions that have a high return on investment. And if we can demonstrate with cold hard numbers that this is in everyone's interest, we can bridge that gap a bit. Love that question. I love calls to action. Yes, I'm here for a call to action. Yes, absolutely. First, if your organization would like to be part of the water conference, for example, register now because the verification is due by the end of July. Just do that. Disclose. You know, if you're in an entity, we work with cities, states, and regions. We work also with public and private sector to disclose. I love that I work for an NGO, so it is largely free. And there's enormous resources that we can provide to help with the disclosure journey. That's another, you know, we cannot measure, we cannot manage what we don't measure. So we have to have those metrics. I encourage you to engage that to get the metrics that you need to be able to drive decisions. And then the last kind of call is to, I think it's a huge missed opportunity to look at this only as the doom and gloom risk factor, to see the opportunities that are available. And I say that with reverence for there's a crisis, and I'm aware that we don't want to be flippant about that. I'm not, but I do think that there's enormous opportunity that is to be had, and we are just not looking at the whole picture yet. So engage, yes, and.
Thank you. In those international fora, I would add also the Convention on Biological Diversity. That's going to be a crucial moment, just announced finally around mid-December in Montreal, not far. So finally, it's going to happen, and this is going to be crucial for the next 20 years on how are we going to preserve the ecosystems that precisely regulate water, filter water, provide water. This is going to be a huge one. Also, focusing on that for all the stakeholders from your side. I would be interested to know what's your background. Maybe you've been a negotiator. It's important to in fact, bringing up the CBD reminds me, all these conferences, the COP for UNFCCC, CBD, we have the Oceans conferences that we've had this year, and we'll have still one in Lisbon to go. We have to find ways, and this would be answering your question directly, we would have to find a way to connect all those and connect the dots. We're trying hard with the European Green Deal. We need to be able to value those systems, the ecosystems. We need to bring forward the natural capital. Apart from the cultural change, we need indeed politicians to keep winning elections. And for that, you need to show them numbers on how this benefits communities in numbers. This is also part of the deal. So what I'm getting at is, how can you value nature at the same time joining the dots? How can you go towards a nature positive, beyond the carbon neutral, beyond the the certification neutral, if that exists? Can we go to a nature positive concept where we comprise all the benefits that nature provides in terms of climate, avoiding pollution? How can the value of all that, because that's going to be massive, and convince many people, not least the negotiators in those fora.
I'm going to take advantage of my prerogative to just add briefly to the responses you got. I was a climate negotiator starting in the 90s for many, many years, and I was in government for a long, long time. Then I switched over to the private sector, where I helped coalitions of NGOs as well as major corporations improve their own sustainability and, to your point, engage in these international processes. And what I would say to you is, you can't wait until you get there to do it. The role of the private sector in advancing the policy positions of the governments themselves is huge at this point, and particularly positive. The change is monumental from where we started in the 90s, when most of the business community that was concerned about it was basically fossil fuels, and they just didn't want to be there, and they didn't want anybody to bother them, and they were in hiding. There were thousands upon thousands of businesses from China. I talked to young Chinese entrepreneurs who are doing small grids, to major fossil fuel companies there. And I would say that if you're not part of a coalition or several of them at this point, so that you can feed into your own government's position, you should consider that. You can go to these COPs, as Elizabeth was saying. You've got to register well in advance and get your credentials organized and so on. It's a pain in the neck, but you can do it. there's never been more opportunity for the private sector to engage because governments know they can't do all this on their own. They need you, they need your resources, they need your know-how, they need your innovations, they need your investments. So the door is quite wide open, but it's also complicated to figure out how to go through it. So I would say join other groups where you have common interests, and there's a huge opportunity for you to be there, and they want you to be part of this. They need that engagement. Anyway, other questions? Part of the whole life cycle. You go. Right?
Thank you. I understood your question now. And in fact, on the context of joining the dots I was mentioning earlier, when we look at complex supply chains and try to map the emissions across all of them, are global now, you want to at the same time also gather information about resource use, about water use. So you can also measure circularity, the circular economy, because they are, 50% of the emissions globally come from the way we exploit and process materials. So at the end of the day, you're trying to have the full picture of sustainability as a label by looking into the whole value chain first, carbon, yes, but also material use, etc., etc., etc. You have the whole sustainability picture.
Thanks, Ann. So I'm interested in this whole idea of water culture. What would you say are the top 3 obstacles to changing the water culture?
Wait a minute.
Oh, no, top 3.
Well, these are really basic elements, like knowing that the planet is finite, that we don't have, 3 planets or 4 planets, and we cannot go to Mars as some purport or anything. We have the water that we have, so therefore, and we're growing as a population. So passing these messages of finite resources, it's important, I think. I wouldn't know how to bring about these changes really, but this is essential, I think.
So I'll add that I think part of the culture is language, in that we've talked about environmental impact in a manner through my lifetime, which has gone. I think some folks in policy and in both civil society and across academia and in institutions see, can get in the weeds of it or see it as kind of other than what they do. And we have to kind of integrate it into what we are doing in each area. I think that integration is key. I brought up my daughter earlier, and it's a bit silly, but I think this is a good way to kind of condense what I'm saying of she said to me, why are you talking, like, why do people say save the earth? Like, why aren't we like, you're all gonna die? Like, you specifically. I was like, your campaign needs a little bit of work. I'm not sure that will register, but if we start to talk about what is the impact to individual entities, what is the impact to this individual entity, because psychologically we can often not see beyond what is this impact to the entity today. How do we see this as something that is baked into the fabric of all decision making, not as separate from it? So I think in changing, for me, it's not limited just to water, but water is certainly part of that. That we have to think about how is nature, how is climate integrated into every decision and every entity. And then the third piece that I would add is the idea of what are the metrics that we're applying to this? We need to be asking, is there a price? Are you pricing water? Are we pricing water? What does that look like? We have to be able to have a comparable language to discuss it across the globe that works and is comparable.
One more point on that. When I was younger, talking to a bunch of NGOs about water, and they said, well, it's a public good. It should be free for everyone. I mean, that's just how we should handle it, right? And I looked at them and I said, well, in most of the countries of the world, that's how they approach it. It's free. And how's that going? Because there wasn't clean water. People didn't have access to water, and that sort of put them back on their heels. But I do think, in terms of your point, Elizabeth, about language, that we do treat these things, and about their being finite, we do treat them as if they're not finite and as if they're free. And moving away from that feels like a loss. But my point earlier was we have to create in people's imagination the sense that their lives can actually be better after we make these needed changes, not worse. We're not all going to be living in some cramped down little pod somewhere, that we can actually have better lives. And I don't yet think that language nor that imagination is there. So I'm sure all of you have thoughts on that. Do we have other questions for our incredible panel?
Yeah, on I guess the topic of pricing water made me think about externalities, which is something we're starting to talk about now. Tying together a couple of things. So I'm focusing on climate resilience and specifically mitigation here. So we've talked a lot about costs and paying for it. No one said we can't do this. Or all the discussions, no one said this is impossible. But on your second I, which I think was investment, you also, Manuel, talked a little bit about ecological services, talked about natural capital, and we haven't had much talk about that yet, in that there are multiple beneficiaries to being more resilient about how we manage our natural resources, and here specifically water. But I think we've done a pretty poor job of trying to quantify that and really look at the beneficiaries when we do go down that road to being more resilient. I look at this from a water utility perspective, and there's this expectation that whatever's done by a water utility to make your city more resilient is gonna be paid for by the water utility. We don't actually pay for it. Our customers pay for that. And then we get to the point very, very quickly of being unaffordable for our water service. So we've got to find a better way to be able to spread this around and look at the beneficiaries. I do think that ecological services, looking at what the value is of that and advancing the science on payment for ecological services, for example, could go a long way with that. But again, you've got to broaden the net. I think when we look at the traditional funders of water infrastructure, it's not going to get us where we need to go on climate resilience. Another comment, not a question, but feel free to respond.
Just to react to that, I think I read an article recently on how the West is suffering under drought, and these issues arise very, very clearly there in the Colorado River. You know, distributing water to 40 million people. I mean, it's a huge amount. And I was reading this article about how cities like Phoenix, Las Vegas, San Diego, etc., um, are suffering, and Los Angeles, of course, but they're doing better than they would if they had not in the last 20 years started actually these resilient investments. So the situation is bad, yes, but actually, if you look at the half full glass, it would be much worse. There were some visionaries in those cities, in particular, that have actually advanced things in the last 20 years. There's much more to be done because climate is a moving target, as I was saying earlier. But you know, I think the roots are there and the seeds are there already.
To your comment, I think that so I would one initiative that I'd love to just flag as we think through this, because there's no benefit in us not looking at the truth. We have to look at the truth. The externalities have to be accounted for. One initiative that I've been excited about is the Matchmaker program at CDP, where we've had go on our website. Also, you should all disclose. But the Matchmaker program looks at climate resilient infrastructure projects and matches them with investment, with capital. Sometimes alternative capital sources, and I think it's a way of shifting our thinking around how do we bridge that gap. And we also need to be thinking about public authorities, which we haven't had the same kind of reporting from, but are starting to. And that matchmaker idea and thinking about how we can have creative funding sources is key to implementing all of the fantastic promises and goals that have been made.
If I may add, and this is good investment. I mean, the numbers that we have are for adaptation in general, but for water adaptation in particular are clear. You know, I think the global gap in financing for water infrastructure is around 200 billion euros per year. But if we invested that money globally, looking globally, not only the EU, we would get a return of 500 billion euros, more or less. I think these are the figures, correct me if I'm wrong. So the numbers are there saying, these are investments that make a lot of economic sense.
Given that there's that huge gap and given that there's a bit of a backlash against ESG at the moment and a few elements of headwind against global growth, we all know right now, and an energy shock due to what's going on in the Ukraine. What I'd love to hear as a final closeout for our session, what the two of you think are the most important policy changes, mechanisms, incentives, standards at the national or the local level, whatever is your thought in closing out about what is most important to helping those investments get made, because they're not being made despite the rate of return.
Why is the money not flowing? Right. Okay, I think I'm gonna throw this because I think it's important. We were discussing the private sector. I think globally is around 9% of the investment on water systems comes from private, and I think it's a huge opportunity there. Now, how to enable it? A possibility is warranted. It's guaranteed. I tell you what we're doing in Europe. We have an European Fund for Sustainable Development Plus, which has been approved as part of the next 7-year budget. And there we're reserving 40 billion to ensure that private companies, startups that want to invest in sustainable water management can get a warranty over their investments, so that, you know, in case of, these are sometimes risky projects, and we know that these are public good projects. So we help them out, we push them a bit with guarantees. That's one possibility.
I think that we need disclosure in every jurisdiction, and we need disclosure that does not have a stifling effect on both information or flow of capital. We need disclosure that is high quality and comparable and actionable. I think that's a key policy shift that is happening, but is a priority. And then I think that we also need to be building the public-private engagement so that we can have meaningful implementation. It's good to have these goals. These goals are fantastic. Plans are better than goals, and we need the policies to get the plan.
If I may add, and sorry, just came to my mind, I'm a bit of a scatterbrain, as you can see. You know, we have in there, you also the taxonomy on sustainability, and that's also has helped in terms, I think transparency, what you mentioned, is crucial. This is really, if I had to name one general concept that will help make investment flow, is transparency. We're not in a market that is transparent for the important things in life, like water. You know, we cannot live without water. In the UDIS taxonomy, what it does is labels investments as sustainable. So not to have to finish with the greenwashing, with objective criteria, trying to say, okay, you know, this economic activity, this investment in a dam, this investment in a water reuse system, desalination, is it sustainable or not? Then we go through experts' advice, and then you assign the label sustainable, not sustainable. This doesn't actually affect investments or curtail them, but tells investors, if you want to be sustainable, then invest on this, and don't do it in this. At the moment, it's a bit of a mess where, you know, everybody's trying to be sustainable. Are they objectively, according to experts, are they?
So that EU approach is a government-based taxonomy. In the US, at least, we have a little bit of a pushback on ESG. So Elizabeth, I'd be curious to know if you think this needs to be something that's mandated and consistent and standardized, or is it enough that the demand is there from consumers and from investors? We could manage it. It will still have its impact if it continues to be through the private sector, through the NGO sector.
I think it's a balance. So we will never, you know, I'm frequently having a hearty conversation with my European colleagues. We'll never have double materiality here in the US. We won't. We don't have a financial system that was built for double materiality. It's just, regulation will not succeed if that's our standard. It may be our aspiration in an academic sense, or it may be what our goal is, but it doesn't fit. There's not a one size fit all across every jurisdiction. That does not mean that we cannot have high quality, meaningful standards, that we cannot have jurisdiction and sector appropriate information. We need transparency, and I don't think that it is enough to have it without a bit of the regulatory piece, but we don't want regulation to stifle transparency or innovation. So we have to find that balance. It's critical. I think that is happening. But it will not be a one size across the globe solution. Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience? If not, I think we should just thank Elizabeth and Manuel very much for their contribution this afternoon.